Hello, today I'm going to be talking to you about Kowloon Motor Bus. Now, KMB, with its fleet of more than 4,000 buses, is the biggest bus operator in Hong Kong and the largest operator of double-deck buses in the world. It has 642 bus routes serving Kowloon and the New Territories, running out of 4 enormous multi-storey bus garages. Also, since the opening of the first cross-harbour tunnel in 1972, KMB has also served Hong Kong Island through the provision of 111 daytime cross-harbour tunnel routes, most of them in partnership with other franchise holders. Kowloon Motor Bus can trace its origins back as far as 1933, which was a significant year for the British bus industry because it was the year that London Transport was founded. Ramsay MacDonald's national government passed an act to unify London's buses with London's Underground and, most importantly, to eliminate competition. As a British colony, Hong Kong was watching events in London with great interest, and the colonial government felt prompted to do something similar to regulate the bus industry. But rather than nationalisation, Hong Kong opted for franchising, one franchise for Hong Kong Island and one franchise for Kowloon and the New Territories. The Kowloon side franchise was awarded to the Kowloon Motor Bus 1933 Limited, which was incorporated in April 1933 by 5 Chinese business partners. Perhaps one of the best known is Louis Leung, a businessman originally from Canton province who brought a lot of transport experience to the new company, and who is probably best remembered for his lovely building in Lai Chi Kok Road, which is now Grade 1 listed. By the end of the year, Kowloon Motor Bus had just over 100 buses, and the fleet had risen to 140 buses, operating 17 routes by the time of the Japanese occupation in December 1941. By the end of the occupation, nearly 4 years later, with most of the buses having been requisitioned by the Japanese army, the company built bus bodies on any truck chassis that it could get its hands on. World War II was over, but the continuing civil strife in China meant that Hong Kong was witness to immigration on a massive scale, and the directors of KMB immediately saw the potential of the double-decker as a crowd shifter. In 1948, another one of the founding directors, Mr. William Louis Sui Tak, went to London to look at the double-deck buses there, and from London to the Daimler plant at Coventry, where he promptly placed an order for 20 Daimler CVG5s. The first ones arrived at the end of 1948, but it was several months before they could be used, as many of the signboards in Nathan Road had to be raised, and lots of tree branches had to be lopped. Kowloon's first double-deck buses ran on the 17th of April 1949 on Route 1 from the Star Ferry to Kowloon City, thus beginning an association with double-deckers that endures to this day. Let's have a look at the buses most associated with those early post-war years. At the end of the war, KMB put in a request to the military authorities for whatever vehicles it could get, and in 1946 received 30 Bedford OB chassis with petrol engines. These were given austerity-style bodies featuring wooden slatted seats. Some of the bodies were built locally and had timber frames, while others, like this one, had metal-framed bodies in the style of the Bedford OWB, which may have been shipped from the UK. These buses were later fitted with Perkins P4 diesel engines. The sliding metal gates shown on the model were fitted in about 1950. These buses lasted until 1959. This early Daimler CVG5 was delivered in about June 1950. Early deliveries of this type strongly resembled their British counterparts, with just an open rear platform for both boarding and alighting. By the mid-1950s this was deemed to be inadequate and unsafe, so an extra door was cut in at the front, and both doors were protected by tubular steel frames to prevent people from falling off. It says a lot about wage rates that these buses had a crew of 4, 1 driver and 3 conductors, plus there were gatemen to open and close the gates at busy stops. Like the OB, these buses had wooden slatted seats. This bus survived until 1976. One of these Daimlers has been preserved by KMB and returned to its original condition. In 1954, Daimler started to supply CVG5 chassis with a so-called Birmingham front, a device used by a number of chassis manufacturers to disguise the appearance of the radiator and to give a more modern appearance to what was basically a very old-fashioned design. K&B had 90 Daimler CVG5s with Birmingham fronts. The first 6 were delivered as before with just an open rear platform, but the last 30, delivered in 56 and 57, came purpose-built with twin entrances and platform gates. This is an earlier delivery from 1955 that was modified to a 2-door layout. Some of these Daimlers had very long service lives. This particular one survived until 1983. This is one of the 1956 deliveries that came supplied with 2 doors, and this one was delivered in November. Between 1964 and 65, the whole fleet was fitted with power-operated folding doors, and the gatemen were made redundant. This bus also chalked up a creditable 25 years in service, being retired in 1981. The 2A route started serving Shamshui Po, literal translation Deepwater Pier, in December 1952, and by the 1960s had been extended from Kowloon City to Nautau Kok. The route it runs nowadays is broadly similar, except it now starts at Mei Fu. By the 1970s, many of the older Daimler CVGs still had their exposed radiators, although they were nearly all fitted with Manchester-style tin fronts in 1975 and 76. Meanwhile, many of the older double-deckers were modified in 1971 to accommodate a seated conductor near the front door. Passengers were instructed to board at the front, pay the conductor at his desk and alight at the rear, thus reducing the bus crew to just 2 persons. To warn waiting passengers to have their fare ready to pay on entry, these buses received yellow stripes around the front. So successful was this experiment that it prompted the company to go for full one-man operation with fare boxes on all types of vehicle. This bus was withdrawn in 1980, by which time it was 30 years old. Another survivor was 4963, a May 1949 delivery, which soldiered on until March 1980, by which time it had received a Manchester-style front and the new livery used on one-man operated buses, complete with London-style coin in the slot signs. A number of these old vehicles were retained for routes with a width restriction, as they were only 2.3 metres wide. This particular bus retired in March 1980, aged nearly 31, at which point it passed to the driver training fleet. It's not known how long 4963 stayed there. Sister vehicle 4961 was later rescued from the training fleet for preservation. Turning now to single-deckers, this Sedan Mark 17 is typical of the single-deck buses purchased for lesser-used services in Kowloon. K&B ordered 100 of these front-engine buses, which were delivered between 1957 and 58. The bodywork by Metal Sections was typical of the colonial-style bodies built on several types of single-decker delivered from the 50s through to the early 70s. This bus is seen on Route 10, which in the late 50s was a shuttle service between Jordan Road Ferry and the Star Ferry. Although this was the first large order for single-deckers that K&B had ever placed, the Sedans didn't last long by Hong Kong standards, the last of them being withdrawn by 1971. L17 was one of 100 Albion Victor VT17s ordered in 1960 for delivery in 1961. They had Leyland engines and manual 5-speed gearboxes, and bodies by the British Aluminium Company, which was shipped from the UK completely knocked down and assembled by K&B themselves, as were the bodies on most of the vehicles we've seen so far. All of them were fitted with powered doors in the mid-1960s and converted for one-man operation in the mid-70s. All of them lasted into the 1980s, by which time 3 had been rebodied and several had received newer, more powerful engines for use on hilly routes with width restrictions. These buses were useful in that respect because they were only 2.3 metres wide. Now, it's buses like this that used to make Hong Kong such an interesting place. 10 of these Ford Thames Traders were introduced in batches over 2 years, this one being the first, delivered in 1961. The make of bodywork is not known. Although these buses probably did appear on other routes from time to time, their principal allocation was to the 30, from Kai Tak to the nationalist enclave at Rennie's Mill, via Anderson Road and Poland Road South. 2 very narrow little lanes, which explains why these vehicles were always having crash damage repaired. They survived until 1969, when they were replaced by Albion Chieftains, and in 1973 Route 30 was renumbered 90. L115, an Albion Victor VT23, was delivered in September 63, rebodied in 78 and finally scrapped in October 1983. The VT23 was an incremental improvement on the VT17. It was a little bit longer, a little bit wider, and the engine was a little bit more powerful. This time the bodywork was by Metal Sections, who had supplied all the double-deck bodies seen so far, and these bodies were assembled by K&B. Like the VT17s, they were constructed with tubular sliding gates, and these were converted to electric folding doors a couple of years later. This bus is shown on Route 76 from Yuanlong to Shengshui, which was originally Route 17 before major route renumbering in 1973. As thousands of refugees flooded into Hong Kong in the 1960s and transport services came under increasing pressure, K&B desperately hunted for the biggest buses it could buy. It was legally obliged to buy British buses, but the longest buses it could get were to the UK legal maximum length of 9.1 metres, and Daimler declined to build anything bigger for export. AEC, however, had an export chassis which it was prepared to modify to take a double-deck body, and the result was this 10.4 metre AEC Regent 5, the first of which entered service in 1963. K&B ordered a total of 210 similar buses with bodies by either British aluminium or metal sections. A165 was from the last batch delivered in 1966. The first modification that was made to the long AECs is that they were fitted out to accommodate a seated conductor near the front door and, like the CVG5 we saw earlier, painted with yellow stripes to warn passengers to have their money ready. Then, between 1976 and 1982, they were all refitted for one-man operation. The staircase was moved to the centre, the two doors were closed up, and two new doors, a narrow one at the front for the driver to take fares and a wider exit by the stairs in the middle. The cream livery shown here was introduced in 1982 and was gradually adopted for all vehicle types. This vehicle was retired in November 1983, but a similar vehicle, A165, is preserved in the UK. Daimlers were obviously stung by their biggest export customer turning to a rival manufacturer, and they were quick to produce a similar 10.4 metre product. K&B bought 220 of these, the first 20 of which were the last rear platform, rear staircase buses they ever bought. The remaining 200 were all built with the revised door and stair arrangement adopted for one-man operation. The last half-cab buses bought by K&B were 115 9.4 metre Daimlers delivered up until 1972, and these were the last half-cab buses built in Britain. The last of the K&B half-cab buses ran in service in 1992. Leyland Motors, which had bought Albion in 1951, continued to develop front-engine bus chassis for export, but the company was running into difficulties. In 1970, K&B placed an order for 150 10.2 metre Viking EVK41s. Although the frame height was lower than the Victor, the short front and rear overhangs were well adapted to roads in the new territories, many of which were still in poor condition. However, Leyland was very slow to fulfil the order, and in frustration K&B cancelled the order after only 50 had been delivered. The Vikings were good vehicles, but the front door was a long way behind the driver, which caused a problem when it came to one-man operation. Nevertheless, most of them managed to notch up 20 years in service. After cancelling their order with Leyland, K&B was still looking for 100 single-deckers and bought 100 Seddon Pennine 4s instead. Pretty soon they wished they hadn't, as the bus was spectacularly unsuited to the subtropical climate of Hong Kong. They were delivered between 1970 and 1972, by which time one of them had already been scrapped because of an engine fire. The humidity played havoc with their electrical systems, and the powerful V8 engines made them difficult for drivers to control. The fiberglass front panels were highly susceptible to damage, and in less than 5 years 37 of them had either been scrapped or had become unserviceable. The last of the Seddon Pennines were withdrawn in 1980 after as little as 8 years in service. In 1975, K&B went back to Leyland and placed an order for 30 Viking EVK 55s, 8 of which were built in Leyland's Tanzanian factory in Dar es Salaam, and L308 was one of those. The original bodywork was by a local firm, Union Auto Body Builders, to a design they had developed for a customer in Macau. Between 1984 and 85, most of the EVK 55s were rebuilt in K&B's own workshops, and this model shows the rebuilt version. L308, the last of the batch, was withdrawn in 1992 and is now preserved by the company. It now carries an Albion badge, although this is probably only for sentimental reasons. Leyland officially dropped the Albion name in 1972, 4 years before this bus was delivered. After the cancellation of the half-cab Daimler CVG6, K&B started to buy its replacement, the rear-engine Daimler CRG6 Fleetline. It placed a total of 450 Fleetlines in service between 1974 and 79, which it ordered in 3 batches of 150. D737 is from the first batch, showing the appearance of these buses when they first entered service. Designed for one-man operation, the front entrance has been narrow to stop people sliding on without payment. The Fleetlines were all 10 metres long, and apart from a handful of prototypes, the first 300 were bodied by metal sections. This particular bus was registered in May 1975 and scrapped in April 1988. D803 is another metal sections bodied Fleetline, shown here in post-1982 livery and with the new style of logo which the company introduced for its golden anniversary in 1983. These high-capacity buses became the mainstay of the busiest urban Kowloon routes, as well as the new routes serving the Cross Harbour Tunnel, which opened in 1972. Both the major franchise holders seriously underestimated the amount of extra business that the tunnel would generate, but at least K&B was in the fortunate position of having new vehicles ready to put into service when the surge came. This bus entered service in January 1976 and was finally scrapped in September 1988. Now, this monstrosity is my candidate for the ugliest bus ever built. K&B had concerns about corrosion of the steel metal sections bodies, and for their third batch of 150 Fleetlines they turned instead to the British Aluminium Company, which had recently supplied a small number of double-deck bus bodies to Singapore bus services using this extremely angular design, presumably for the purpose of eliminating any panel bending and therefore making it easier to build. One of the problems associated with this design was that the upper deck windows were so high up most seated passengers couldn't see out of them. K&B instructed that these buses revert to the traditional mostly red livery, which succeeded in softening their shape a little. This bus managed less than 14 years in service and was scrapped in December 1991. After the cessation of front-engine bus production for the home market in the UK in the early 70s, K&B continued to look for a viable alternative so as to avoid the cooling problems faced by rear-engine buses in a hot climate. One possible option was offered by South African bodybuilder Busaf, who experimentally built a double-deck body on a Guy Victory J export bus chassis of the type which was currently being supplied with single-deck bodies to Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. This is one of 4 prototypes supplied by Busaf to K&B in 1976. The resulting vehicle was very tall, over 4.5 metres, but the concept obviously worked. These buses rang alarm bells at Leyland, who were now faced with the very real prospect of losing Far Eastern sales to a South African competitor. Leyland's response to Busaf, and also to Dennis, another company which was dabbling in front-engine bus chassis, was the Victory Mark II, essentially a Leyland Worldmaster chassis frame containing the running units of the Guy Victory. Leyland engineers were able to lower the chassis so that the resulting double-decker clocked in at a height of 4.46 metres. K&B cancelled their final order for 150 Leyland Fleetlines and instead bought 150 Victory 2s to be bodied by Walter Alexander of Falkirk. One problem with this first batch was that the driver's door was mounted externally, correctly shown here by Corgi, and caused the bus to exceed the maximum permitted width. A special dispensation was needed to get the buses on the road. Once they were on the road, the Leyland Victories experienced problems with squealing brakes, and this took a couple of years to resolve. But there were other issues as well, and one member of the class was shipped back to the UK for Leyland engineers to examine. Fortunately, they came up with a number of modifications which were applied to the whole fleet. This is G374 from the final batch of 200, which were delivered between 1981 and 1983. This bus shows the second style of livery associated with the Leyland Victory, and this was applied to the majority of them. The mostly red colour scheme seen in the previous bus was only applied to early deliveries. You can see now that the driver's door slides internally. As well as the Leyland Victory, K&B also ordered 360 of Dennis's new Jubilant chassis, which was mechanically somewhat similar to the Victory Mark II. Also, the first 210 of them had Alexander bodywork, which differed only in minor details from the bodies built on the Victory chassis. However, the order for the last 150 bodies was placed with Jubilant Metsec. Metal sections had been acquired by Jubilant coach builders in 1980, and the product range overhauled such that the company was now able to offer its Far Eastern customers a much improved product, with less propensity to corrode. Some would say it was also better looking. This final Leyland Victory is seen wearing the 1982 livery, which all of them wore towards the end. K&B ordered a total of 542 Leyland Victories, delivered between 1978 and 1983, all of which carried Alexander bodywork. Only 540 actually entered the fleet, as the last 2 were sold to New Lantel Bus before registration. New Lantel Bus went on to purchase a further 6 second-hand Victories from K&B. This is a bus from the third batch of 65 vehicles delivered in 1981. It was withdrawn in April 1993, and all of the Leyland Victories were gone by the end of 1998. When When London Transport began the premature disposal of its DMS class of Daimler and Leyland Fleetlines, Hong Kong operators beat a path to their door. K&B ordered 100 of the midlife buses, and these started to arrive in 1981. They were first modified for tropical conditions. The windows were replaced, they were re-upholstered, the entrance doors were fixed so that they only half opened, and because of concerns that they were not going to be sturdy enough for crush loading conditions, every one of them carried Chinese wording between the decks asking people not to overload the bus. This is former DMS 797, which was new in January 1974, shipped to Hong Kong in summer 81 and retired in October 85. By 1979, the fate of British Leyland's bus division was in the balance. It was designing a bus that would replace the Atlantean, the Fleetline, the Bristol VRT and probably the Titan as well. It had to have a separate chassis so that the bus companies could specify their own bodies. It had to accommodate both Leyland and Gardner engines, and above all else it had to be good. And the B45 Olympian was just that. BL3 was one of the 3 prototypes supplied to K&B in 1981. They were all 10.3 metres long, with bodywork by Eastern Coachworks, which was a part of the British Leyland Group specialising in low-height double-deckers, which is why these prototypes were unnecessarily low. But K&B liked them, and the stage was set for a massive influx of this new type of chassis. The arrival of the Leyland Olympians heralds the arrival of a completely new phase in the development of K&B's bus fleet, the era of the 3-axle bus. In 1979, vehicle legislation in Hong Kong was updated to align with the UK and EU, where it was permitted to use a vehicle of up to 12 metres length and 24 tonnes gross weight, provided they spread the weight through 3 axles. The Hong Kong government let it be known that this was the direction which they wanted franchise holders to go in, and the bus companies duly put out feelers to the manufacturers. After much consideration, K&B ordered 6 12-metre 3-axle buses for evaluation, 3 Dennis Dragon and 3 Metro Camel Wayman Metrobuses. The first 2 Super Metro buses arrived in May 1981, some 7 months ahead of their competitor. Leyland vehicles declined to participate in these trials because they already had the new Olympian to promote and didn't want to spend resources working up yet another new model. But the story goes that envoys from the UK's Board of Trade had a word in their ear about the undesirability of letting German competitors into the Hong Kong bus market, and this seemed to do the trick, bringing about a change of heart. A 12-metre Leyland Olympian was later shipped to Hong Kong, which K&B tried for 3 months and then purchased. The outcome of the evaluation was that K&B ordered the Dennis Dragon first, followed by the Leyland Olympian. The other great step forward we'll look at in this section is the introduction of air-conditioned buses. The Hong Kong government was keen on air conditioning. The MTR trains had it, and a large number of luxury coaches were built with it. But the Hong Kong bus operators felt that they should be able to charge a premium fare to offset the additional cost of buying and operating air-conditioned buses, and it was some time before these arguments were adequately resolved. Meanwhile, small batches of air-conditioned single-deckers were purchased, air-conditioned double-deckers proving more challenging. There had been several trials using air conditioning plants powered by a separate engine, but all these were very costly to run. The breakthrough came in 1989 with the first air-conditioned Leyland Olympian, as used by KCRC and Citybus, and with air conditioning plant driven by the bus engine. Things then moved on very quickly, and within 5 years K&B had placed its very last order for non-air conditioned buses. On the 9th of May 2012, K&B's last few non-aircon buses, locally known as hot dogs, ran in service for the very last time, marking the end of an era. This is M1, the first of 3 super Metrobuses delivered to K&B in 1981. It could accommodate 160 passengers, including 36 standing. These vehicles arrived with Rolls-Royce Eagle engines, as evidenced by the Rolls-Royce sticker on the front panel, but these were later replaced by Gardner 6 LXCTs, which were the operator's engine of choice. The body design of the Metrobuses was actually the Mark II, without MCW's trademark asymmetrical windscreen. Although M1 and M2 was shipped out fully built up, M3 was supplied as a knockdown kit, a first for MCW, which the company assembled with the assistance of an MCW engineer. M1 later became 3M1. K&B's first order for Metrobuses was not as expected for super Metrobuses. Instead, it was for a fleet of 9.7 metre 2-axle buses for use on routes where a single-decker was inadequate and a longer bus inappropriate. K&B took a total of 88 of these Metrobuses in 5 separate orders between 1983 and 1988. M45 was delivered in May 1985 and had 82 seats. All of these buses carried this livery throughout. These buses were used all over the network, but of particular interest are the last 8 delivered, which had more powerful Cummins 280 horsepower engines for Route 51 over the Taimo Shan, where they provided a welcome increase in capacity over the Albion Viking VK55s that they replaced. When K&B decided to buy the 3-axle Metrobus, it opted for the more versatile 11-metre version, and orders were placed for 254 such buses, which were delivered between 1986 and 1990. They were used on Kowloon urban routes, where they displaced the last remaining Leyland Victories and Dennis Jubilants, as well as a handful of AEC Regent 5s and a number of ex-London Transport Daimler Fleetlines. S3M228, the S standing for short, was registered in November 1989 and had 111 seats. This bus was probably scrapped in 2004. As I mentioned earlier, Leyland Vehicles had a change of heart about building a 3-axle 12-metre vehicle and sent a demonstrator to Hong Kong in 1982. This was 3BL1, which had a 5-speed fully automatic gearbox and a Leyland TL11 turbocharged engine, but this was later replaced by a Gardner engine. Unique among the 3-axle vehicles, the tag axle, the non-powered rear axle, was self-tracking at speeds of 12 km per hour and above to minimise tyre scrub when turning. The bodywork by Eastern Coachworks had many similarities to the 2-axle Olympian prototypes seen earlier, and was built to the same low height of 4.16 metres, which had the effect of emphasising its length. 3BL1 had 104 seats and space for 53 standing. K&B ordered 162 production versions of the 12-metre Olympian, but these differed substantially from the ECW bodied demonstrator. First, the bodies were all supplied by Alexander's as completely knockdown kits, which were assembled by the company. Second, the engines were the popular Gardner 6 LXCT, and the gearboxes were from Volvo, although these were later changed to Voith gearboxes. These buses arrived in 4 batches, and there were detailed differences between them, but they were all built to the same 3-door configuration. The production Olympians were delivered between 1983 and 86. This one, 3BL39, was one of the second batch registered in April 84. This bus is from K&B's last order for non-aircon Olympians, and it was delivered in September 93. The story goes that the Hong Kong government made representations to K&B to the effect that they should soft pedal on the universal introduction of aircon buses, which did of course carry a premium fare. Consequently, this order for 80 buses and a similar order for Dennis Dragons was changed to non-aircon buses. The first 50 Leylands were delivered by 1994. Then Volvo, which had now taken over Leyland, stopped production of the Leyland Olympians. The last 30 buses which were delivered in 1995 were the re-engineered Volvo Olympian, and these are the very last non-aircon buses to be registered for franchise services in Hong Kong. Between 1987 and 1990, K&B purchased 91 air-conditioned Toyota Coaster minibuses, which were used on lightly trafficked services. They seated 24 and were the long wheelbase version of the minibuses commonly used as red and green public light buses. As these were essentially van conversions, the roofs didn't have a lot of heat insulation, so the manufacturer fitted a steel sunshade covering the whole roof to keep the interior cool, and the windows were also tinted. One of the routes where these buses were used was the 90 to Rennie's Mill, where they replaced Albion chieftains. They operated this route until 1996, when the township at Rennie's Mill was bulldozed, the bay was filled in, and the new town of Chu Keng Leng was constructed on top of it. In 1988, K&B purchased this wide-bodied MCW Metro rider for comparison with the Toyota Coasters. It was later joined by a second similar vehicle. The Metro riders were air-conditioned and, like the Toyotas, carried this distinctive white livery to distinguish them from non-air-conditioned vehicles. These buses had 33 seats, more powerful 5.9 litre engines and automatic gearboxes. They were used for evaluation on a number of routes but failed to find acceptance, and in 1993 the pair of them was sold. This one returned to England, where it saw further service with an operator in Croydon. Between 1990 and 1995, K&B took delivery of no fewer than 183 Mitsubishi Fuso minibuses with Mitsubishi's own bodywork. At 9.1 by 2.3 metres, these buses were built to similar dimensions to the Carlisle-bodied Dennis Dart demonstrator that was doing the rounds of Hong Kong operators from 1990 onwards, and the two vehicles were closely compared. K&B eventually purchased both types, but ordered more of the Mitsubishis, many of which were fitted with extra luggage racks for use on airport shuttle services. Most of the Mitsubishis chalked up long service lives, and the last of them were replaced in 2012. K&B found the performance of the Dennis Dart demonstrator to be satisfactory and placed an initial order for 20 of the longer 10-metre examples, which were bodied with knockdown kits from Jubilant and were completed in 1993. The first 10 had 43 seats for ordinary services, but the second 10 had 37 seats and extra luggage racks for airport bus services to Kai Tak. A second order for another 20 vehicles was placed, and these were assembled in England by Wadham Stringer and shipped completely built up to Hong Kong. Some of this batch were given up-rated engines and fitted with retarders in order to replace the modified MCW Metro buses which worked the 51 route, until they themselves were replaced by Enviro 200s in 2011. After the Jubilant bodied Dennis Darts, K&B ordered a further 11 Darts with Northern Counties Paladin bodywork, which was shipped completely built up from the UK. Only 6 of them, AA 43 to 48, were registered, and they were put into service in late 95. In March 97, a cross-border shuttle service started at Lok Ma Chau, operated by a subsidiary of K&B called the New Hong Kong Bus Company, and 5 of the 6 Northern Counties Darts were painted yellow and transferred to the shuttle service, along with the remaining 5 that had never been registered. The only bus that was left in the K&B fleet was AA 48, this one, which worked out the rest of its life on the 224X service between Kai Yip and Chim Sha Choi East until it was finally withdrawn in March 2014. As I mentioned earlier, the problem with air conditioning was getting it to work effectively on double-deckers without having to install a separate engine to power it. Leyland engineers, in partnership with Walter Alexander's, put their minds to it and produced the first air-conditioned Leyland Olympian in 1990. K&B purchased 150 of these, and then, when production of the Leyland version was discontinued, they bought a further 869 Volvo Olympians, of which 531 were 11 metres and the remainder were 12 metres. This is the first of the Volvo Olympians shown as delivered, with a Volvo emblem on the radiator, fog lights and black headlight surrounds. These features were not perpetuated in the rest of the production run, although a handful of later Olympians were provided with fog lights. As well as the Leyland and Volvo Olympians, K&B also bought large quantities of air-conditioned Dennis Dragons, all with bodywork by Jubilant. The most numerous were the AD class of 11-metre vehicles, the first batch of which arrived in 1991. They all had Cummins L-series engines and Voith 3-speed automatic transmission. Although the majority had 3+2 seating, the last batch of 80 had 2+2 seating, which reduced the seating capacity to 86, a reduction of 16. This particular bus was registered in March 1997 and withdrawn in March 2015, having achieved its full 18 years on franchise services. K&B also took delivery of 170 12-metre versions of the air-conditioned Dennis Dragon, and these were the 3AD class. The first ones were registered in August 1997 and the last deliveries were in July 98. Unlike the L-series engines in the ADs, which had proved troublesome, the 3ADs had the new Euro 2 compliant Cummins M11 engine with slightly larger displacement and a longer piston stroke. Seating capacity was 99, based on a 2+2 configuration. The last 12-metre Dragons retired in July 2016, by which time all of them had clocked up 18 years of service. Unlike Citybus, K&B didn't buy any short wheelbase Olympians, turning instead to the 9.9-metre Dennis Dragon, which K&B judged would be perfect for polishing off the last of the Leyland Victories and Dennis Jubilants. K&B purchased a total of 235 baby dragons, which were introduced in 3 batches, the earliest in 1993 and the last batch of 50 in 1999. This last batch were the last step entrance buses ordered by K&B and consequently the last ones in passenger service. The ADS class took its final bow on Route 8 from the Star Ferry to Kowloon Station on the 6th of July 2017. This bus, ADS 235, was the last of the batch and is now preserved by the company. So that's the end of this first look at the Kowloon Motor Bus fleet. In part 2 we'll be looking at low floor buses and the era of the golden bus. Bye for now.